Thank you. All right, now can you hear me in the back? Okay, all right. Okay, so I'm a video game designer. That's what I get paid to do. So when I'm not making video games, just as a hobby, I make board games. And what I'm going to talk about today is 19 of those games that I've made over the last 19 years. So first of all, real quick, some of the questions that comes up whenever I give this talk, people say, well, how do I buy these games? How do I get these games? And the answer is you can't. So they're just made really for these two guys here. So these are my sons, Dylan and Jordan, when they were quite a lot younger than they are now. They're made just for them to play with, just for me and my family and my friends to play. The talk is not about the rules and mechanics of these games, because each game I could spend an hour telling you all about the game in detail if you would let me. But I've got to get through 19 of these in about an hour, so we're actually going to go at a fairly fast clip. So I apologize in advance, it'll be a bit of a speed talk here. And mostly what I want to talk about though is the high-level goals and why I did this, what I was discovering along the way, and how that shaped me as a game designer over the last few years. All right, so I'll just get right into it. The first game here, this is back in 1995. Dylan, my youngest son, had just recently been born. Jordan, my older son, he was about 2-3 years old, somewhere around there. And it was Christmas time. So my wife was trying to decorate the house. We were getting all the boxes of Christmas stuff out. And if you have small children, you know, especially around the 2-year-old, what they like to do when you get out boxes of new objects they've never seen before. So as part of just trying to keep my son busy, I decided to make a little game for him. And that was really my goal. I wasn't trying to do anything special. It was just like keep a 3-year-old busy. And while I was at it, as any proud parent or father will do, it's like, well, I got to test him. I got to make sure he's smart. So I need to, I just want to see like what he can take. Can he, match these colors? Does he have a good memory? Things like that. And this is the game we came up with. As you can see, we worked together on it. It's toilet paper tubes and just whatever we found, glitter glue, some old reindeers. And it was just a simple memory matching game. You would put some reindeers underneath and you would hide them. And then we made a little coin eventually, this here. And you could flip it over. You could try to find where the reindeer, what color. And I kept adding more colors and more cones and more shapes. And the game just kind of built up. And we just played it for a while. And that was basically the end of it. The design lessons here, whereas this is an interesting lesson that the goal was not important. And I know for many of you who are game designers, one of the things you hear all the time is the most important thing is the goal. You've got to always have like a very strong goal, always work towards that goal. If the goal's not there, then the game will fall apart. Well, it turns out for a 3-year-old, they don't really care. So for that age group, they're just they're having an activity and they're just having a lot of fun doing that. Pay attention to your audience. This is something I still carry on to this day, is always watching the players. So when people play your game, you look at their faces. You don't really look at your game, you look at them. And you'll know instantly, especially with a young kid, whether or not they're bored, because if they're bored, they'll just get down from the table and walk away. Older adults, they're usually nicer and more polite, but you can still look. If they pull out their iPhone while they're playing your game, you're doing something wrong. The rules don't need to be fixed at this age group either. I didn't write the rules down and type it and point to them while he was playing and say, no, you're breaking the rules, son, don't do that. It was just very flexible. When he adapted to a rule, I would change a rule. We would just like very free form work our way through the game. So that kind of would have been the end of it, and that would have been a very short talk. But what happened was the next year, my wife Toby, who's actually visiting here, she's down in the front row here, so forgive me when I misspeak about what really happened. So she saved that game, which I had kind of forgotten about. So the next year, when she was getting the Christmas decorations out, she was like, oh, why don't you play this with the kids again? Remember this? And I'd forgotten all about it. But I did, when she showed it to me, I was like, it's kind of ugly. It's really like falling apart, and I'm not really proud of this. It would be better if I made this like heirloom game. And what I mean by that is, the vision of Santa Claus's elves in their workshop working on wood with the paint brushes. And it would be something that the kids would have forever, and they could pass it down to their grandchildren and so on. Be this really quality wood design. And I didn't really want to do a mind power thing. I wanted to work more on just like dexterity as the kids were getting a little bit older, and not as much about how smart they were, but their emotion. So I made this game. You've probably seen similar things like that in the store, made out of plastic. It's just a magnet hooked onto the end of a hook and a little fishing rod, and I cut these out of wood and just painted them all. And just made this little fishing game for them. So very simple. Without me even explaining what to do with it, you can kind of get an idea. So some of the lessons here were really that the pieces were more important than the rules. So I never wrote down the rules to this game. I didn't need to. It's just, there's a bunch of pieces, so you just kind of play with them. And you can use the real world too. You don't need a game board. So when I gave this to the kids, the idea was, here's just a bunch of objects. Go make up your own games. So you could sit on your beds and you could fish off your bed. You could take it off the back porch. You could make up games where sometimes maybe you're trying to get the shark and you're a shark hunter. Sometimes maybe the shark is really evil, and if you take the shark then you'll lose the game. So I think it's very flexible. And the other part was just that imagination that would come along with it, and just watching the kids make up these stories. And that was more important than I thought than the rules themselves. And that really taught me a lot of later game designs as I started working on them. Getting up here is much more important than what's down on the table in front of people. All right, moving forward, 5 years old, 2 years old now. So design goal on this one, this Alpha Zutari, was really what I say reduced production stress, because the game before, like making that Santa Claus elf style wooden hand painted thing, I was doing that on Christmas Eve, trying to get it, and blow drying the paint with a hair dryer, trying to get it to dry in time so we could wrap it up and get it under the tree. And so the next year I was like, that was really very stressful, trying to be one of Santa's elves and trying to hit that deadline. So this year what we're going to do instead is I'm going to have my son work with me on the game again, like that first game, where he'd be part of that. Now, of course, he's getting to that age, maybe let's learn a little bit while we're making this game too, because why not? And then if I'm going to teach him alphabet, I might as well teach him about space travel and planets and other things, because why not? So this was the game that we came up with. You could see where he sat. He was on this side of the table, and I was over here on the rest. So the glitter glue came out again. And the simple idea here was we just got a bunch of these old ABC cards with animals, and then you would travel around the galaxy with these spaceships, and when you landed on a letter, you could take the animal of that letter. So it was kind of a collection game where you're moving all around and you're just trying to pick up the different animals and learn about the alphabet and space travel, because that happens in space all the time. So lessons here, one is cannibalize other toys. I didn't need to go out and make all of these handcrafted pieces. It was just enough to raid their toy box. And if any of you, again, have kids, or you were a kid, you know what it's like under your bed, you know what it's like in your drawers. You have all of this stuff that you've accumulated, especially around 5 years old, that you don't even know you have anymore. So I just kind of dug through their toys, got their spaceships, their cards, things they weren't going to use anymore. That really will speed up time on these. You don't need to make everything handcrafted. Even though I said this was to teach alphabet and animals and space travel, it turned out in retrospect, I think my son learned more about the game building process. He learned more from the act of building the game than I believe he did about learning the ABCs and learning about animals. So that process of going through, here's a blank piece of poster board, we're now going to create something and now it's going to come to life and we're going to play it, I think that lesson is much more important. So the next year after that, so now basically it's become a tradition. I've done it enough now that now I start to stress a little bit before Christmas, where it's like, what's going to be the game this year that I'm going to give them for Christmas? I need something under the tree. And so there's always this kind of panic around December, early December, where it's like I start really getting uptight about what I'm going to do next. So I started thinking about like what could be a good game for kids at this age, 6 and 3. And I started looking at classic games and wondering why some of these classic games don't exist anymore. You don't see them very often. And one of them was marbles. And I thought, so why don't kids play with marbles anymore? Instead they collect Pokemon, they don't collect marbles. And so I was like, could I bring back marbles? Could I revive it somehow? And if I could just maybe add in some robots, then that would really help a lot. So we had the robots and the marbles together, and I'm like, this will give maybe a modern twist on it. And the idea was very simple. It's just you're going to throw marbles and you're going to knock over robots, like a very simple game. Just really chaotic. And that's what I wanted to be. Just like, it's kids, it's boys. They should be like throwing marbles at each other. This would be so much fun. So I had this little board, and we built this little kind of stadium for them to play around in, and you would roll the marbles and knock them over. And that was great up until a certain point, and then it just kind of got really tiresome to pick up the marbles, and it would always decay into them just running around the house throwing marbles at each other, not at the robots. So I made these kind of trading cards, and I added an extra level in, a little bit of strategy into it, and tried to tame that chaos a bit. So like I just mentioned, it sounds fun on the surface. What could be more fun than throwing marbles at robots? Well, the problem is that it has to be balanced out with picking up those robots and resetting and finding the marbles under the couch and all of that, which is just a pain. Then the other thing was that we started to realize that the pieces could come to life. And instead of, this is a thing that I find a lot with game design, is that I let the pieces tell me the rules. So I get the piece first, and then I make the rule based on what the piece looks like. So for instance, some of the guys here, like this guy had really, he would tip over a lot. Oops, hang on. Because of his weight, he was very top heavy. So I would make him super strong. And other guys with really wide bases, I would make them a lot weaker to kind of balance out those pieces. And then the final part really was giving the pieces personality. Once we had the robots and I made these cards for them, they all had names. And what I realized, something kind of magical happened, was that the kids started talking about these guys as if they were real when we weren't playing the game. So we might be at a dinner table and they would say, oh yeah, Buzz the robot did this thing. And now that he had a name, he had a personality. And that really added a lot to the game. Again, you're getting into people's heads more than, it doesn't matter about the pieces anymore. Now there's these stories, and from battle to battle, they start to recognize his personality, like a sports player or something, working their way through. All right, so this is actually one of my older games that I built even before I had kids, but I decided to kind of break it out and give it to my kids. They were getting older, and they would be old enough now to play this. It was a strategy game that I built actually early, 1990 or so. If you might have know this game, The Amazing Labyrinth, and I love that board. If you've played that game, it has this excellent board that slides the tiles around. But I actually didn't like the gameplay on top of that board, so I decided to take that board and just kind of make my own take on that game. And then I really wanted to get into this idea of memorable characters that I just talked about, having learned that from the robot game, and trying to figure out, well, if you really have a thief, if you really have these other characters, they could become these personalities, be very strong for that game. And then the other part here, this kind of was a new requirement that came in from my wife, who's when I was working on the fireballs and all the swords and everything in the game, and she said, why do you always make your game so violent? And I was like, well, it's a game, right? It's about dragons and treasures and spells. Of course it's going to be violent. It can't not be violent. That would be very boring, and you just don't understand. You're not a game designer. You need that conflict. You need that energy to keep the game entertaining. And her response was something like, well, if you were a good game designer, you could do it. Well, that was that. All right, so I had to do that. And that actually, you'll see, becomes a requirement in many of my games from that year on. So here's the first kind of prototype version that I did. And this was back again before I had the kids, and I was just kind of playing around with this idea here. I eventually made a wooden board, which I gave to my relatives, to my nephews, when they were about the age that my kids would have been this year. And so I'm like, this will be the easiest Christmas ever. I'll just call up my sister. I will get the game back from her, and I'll just wrap it up and give it to my kids. Everything's done. This is going to be so easy. So I called her up. Oh, and by the way, this was a Christmas gift to my nephews that I had stayed up all night in my dad's workshop, working on, over and over and painting it and everything. So I call her up, and can you send that game back? Your kids are probably too old for it anyway. They'd probably never play it. She's like, oh, I can't do that. We sold it in a garage sale. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is great. So now I'm going to scramble. So anyway, I was actually happy in some ways, and retrospectively I was happy. This was the final board, the new one. It was all tiles instead of wood. It was hand painted, and I spent a lot of time with just decorating it up and making it look really old and kind of heavy game. Here's a close-up of it, and you're just basically moving around trying to get treasures, and it's more of a race. Like I said, I took out the violent part. You can't actually hurt anybody. It's just more of a race to run around and get the treasures. So this one, the kind of lesson here is, if you're not shipping your games, then they don't need to be done. This is great, because our life is so much filled with deadlines and hectic things that you've got to do. But even though I'll give this to the kids at Christmas, it doesn't really say this done, I'm never going to touch it anymore. Instead, it's we're constantly iterating on it, we're constantly changing it. And this game is personally one of my favorites. It still gets a lot of play with a lot of my friends when they come over. And we still hey, let's add a new character, let's change things around, which is great. So you don't need to finish it, you just keep making it better and better. Characters, of course, are excellent expansion opportunities. Like I just mentioned, I found this reptile man one day when I was cleaning out some stuff from my old Dungeons and Dragons days. And it's oh, I should put him into the maze game, and we would sit around and just talk about that. Finally get him into the game. The other thing which was really fun was letting the players to decide the rules. So one of my friends always took way too long to make his move. And you guys, some of you are that guy, and some of you know that guy. And anyway, I'm not that kind of guy. I like to make my moves really fast, and I get really tired when people think. So I made a character in the game who's, she has a timer, she's the witch, and she can curse people that they only get like 20, 30 seconds to make their move. And so every time I played with my friend, I would play with the witch. It's like, guess what? You know, it's just a new rule I added because you're at the table. All right, Junkyard Bots. This was another kind of fun game. Worked on the design goal here is only dice. And can I make a game with just no board, just only dice, no cards, no nothing else? That kind of was the challenge I set to myself. And I got a bunch of these wooden cubes at the craft store. I was really kind of in that character design thing from Maze that I talked about with all the different personalities that the characters would have. But it was like, what if people could make their own characters? What if they could assemble different pieces of rules together and they would come up with a character with a special rule set that was unique to them? The other thing was this fast turns. My kids, 8 and 5 now, like they have no patience either for people thinking. And so they just want their turn to happen all the time. And so this game is like, just got to be fast. It's got to be lightning fast. You roll dice, you make a move, the next person's rolling dice, making a move. Let's just keep on going. And of course, it had a non-violent option. This one was originally, again, your robots are fighting each other. And then we added an extra rule so that Toby could play it with us, which was that you could gain energy and just teleport out of the battle arena. And that was a victory. It's like, you know what? I'm not even going to fight. I win. So kind of added that into it at the very end. So here's how the game starts. Everybody has a very small little robot made up of a couple pieces. And then this junkyard is a bunch of other pieces. And as you play the game, you start revealing the underside of each die. And you can bind them together. And one of the magical things that happened, I didn't realize when I was making the pieces, but when they all go together in so many different ways, characters just form automatically and kind of magically too, which is great. And little things like how you turn your eyebrows makes you evil or makes you sad, or whether your mouth is smiling or frowning, things like that, which is a really wonderful part of the game. And in fact, what it did was when it wasn't your turn, everybody plays with their robot, which is kind of cool. But it's bad because you would get to your turn because the game was so fast and you'd be like, what, it's my turn already? I'm busy playing with my robot. Which is kind of good and bad. But the characters that come out of it were really just wonderful. That's my favorite part of the game, I think. And then how you built your character, like this guy moves really fast, this guy can throw really far, this guy can see really well. You're shaping the rules as you play. You're kind of evolving your robot compared to other people's robots. So some of the design lessons here, like I just mentioned, give people something to fiddle with when there's not their turn. Most of you know this, you're gamers. The meeples, the Carcassonne people, you like to stack them, you like to play with your chips, things like that. It's very important. So as a game designer, I always try to look for pieces that are very tactile, something like heavy, something that feels good in your hands, and you want the players to play with them. You can have 2 victory conditions. This is another great thing. You don't need to have only one goal in your game. You can have as many goals as you feel that you need to have. You have more challenge as a designer, of course, balancing out those different paths to those different goals. But it kind of opens up the space. It's not like first to 100 points or whoever gets the most points wins. There might be alternate ways to win the game. All right, so now the kids are getting older. I'm starting around like October or so trying to figure out what I'm going to do because the scale of everything is kind of increasing. I feel like, oh, what am I going to do next year? It's going to be so good. And I was at a comic book store and I found this guy, Kongzilla. He's almost this size, a little smaller than this. And I saw him at a comic book store and immediately I'm like, I need that piece. I need that in my game. And I don't even know what the game is. I just like, he needs to be in my game, whatever this game's going to be. And so I'm like, I need that. And he's like, that's $100. I'm like, okay, I don't need it yet. Let me think of the game first. That was kind of what I told myself. It's like, when I finally come up with the rules for this game, then I'll justify the expense of spending $100 to go buy this guy. So yeah, Kongzilla, it's got to be in there. And of course, lasers. Because if you have Kongzilla, then you also have to have lasers. And I've always wanted to make a game with lasers. And the kids are 9 and 6. 9 and 6-year-olds can handle lasers. And not quite as exciting for most kids, but for a game designer, asymmetric rules and goals. Like, what could be more exciting than that? So as a designer, and I know many of you in the room are designers, that it's really easy to make a balanced game when everybody plays with the same rules. Because, hey, you're all same rules, of course it's going to be fair. But as soon as you give one person one set of rules and one person another, that can get very difficult to balance. And in this game, I was just like, I wanted everything different. Like, basically 2 different rule sheets, nothing was going to be shared. So this is the final game. You just play it on the floor. You've got, I took these tanks and I mounted laser pointers on them, and I ripped off the turrets off these guys and I stuck mirrors. And one guy's Kongzilla, and they're trying to knock over these buildings, and then the other guy's just trying, it's like pool, except pool with laser beams. That sounds so cool. All right, so you're bouncing your lasers off the mirrors, and you're trying to hit him. And it's basically one guy's setting things up and trying to get a perfect shot in on his head, and you get like bonus points for shooting it right in his mouth. And the other guy's trying to knock down the buildings. So you look at that picture, it's so good. But the design lesson really that I learned from this is I've got to stop making these games bigger and bigger and bigger. This is a problem because this one, in a way, I spent way more time working on it than the kids spent playing it because it was so big that it's an effort to get it out, it's an effort to set it up, it's an effort to clean up afterwards because it takes over the whole living room. And it's also slightly dangerous because you're giving your kids lasers, which is fine. My kids, they can handle lasers at 6. Their friends, I know I couldn't trust them. Or you have to have a waiver every time a friend comes over to play the game, their parents sign. So it actually didn't get a lot of play, unfortunately, and I liked the game a lot. It had a lot of great things going on with it, but it really taught me, it's like at some point it's just too big, it's too elaborate. The other thing though that was interesting was who needs numbers. I tried to make the game with 0 numbers in it, even though it's a game about battling and attacking and damage and things like that. You don't need to know any numbers, which is kind of unique, especially if you're like me who grew up playing these games with huge tables and charts and everything's a number everywhere you look. All right, Monster Hunter, this is probably the most played in terms of hours game that I had made. The kids are 10 and 7 now. I had been playing Diablo 2 a lot, and I started sneaking my kids into the room to play Diablo 2 with me, which seems okay until, Toby, I'm going to pick on her a lot. Normally she's not here when I give this talk. So she was like, why are you letting the kids play Diablo 2? They're 10 and 7. That is way too young to play a violent video game. It's like, it's okay, it's just a video game, right? And if you play Diablo, you know the dismembered harem girls and things like that. It's not really that great. So she was right, and I was wrong. I'll admit that. So I was like, well, I love Diablo, though. What am I going to, the kids need to play this game. So I'll just make a card game version of it. The other thing, too, what I had noticed is I had grown up playing Dungeons & Dragons in high school, and I tried to get my kids back into Dungeons & Dragons at one point, and I was just like, there is no way I'll ever play this game again. And sorry for you role-playing lovers here, but it was just too much to try to get everybody around and read all these books and look at all these charts and tables and build your characters and stuff. So with Monster Hunter, I was like, can I capture the fun parts of what I think of role-playing without all of that headache of looking through tables and charts and rolling dice all the time? So this was the first take I did. I actually did most of the whole game in one afternoon, and I just cut up index cards and just started scribbling pictures on it, and I got it pretty much worked out. And then I spent maybe the next, I don't know, several months gluing cards together, and I actually scanned in pictures from the monster manuals and put them onto the cards and made these really nice cards for the game. This is kind of the final setup. Everybody's a hero, and you just kind of flip over monsters into the middle here. This is how much money you'll make if you kill the monster. And then this is your town. This is what you're holding on to that you could buy, and it costs money. So it's the treadmill that you all know and love from role-playing games, which is I'm going to kill a mouse, I'm going to get a gold, I'm going to buy a dagger, which will let me kill the next biggest thing, which will give me 10 gold, and then so on and so on. And you just basically kill stuff to make more money so you can kill bigger things. And eventually whoever kills the dragon wins. And the reason I say this is the most hours played of all of our games was because the game took about 3 hours, I think, to play. And at that time, it was really hard to get all of us together for long periods of time to sit down. So we'd play it little bit by little bit over the course of, sometimes it felt like months. It would just be setting up on our dining room table. But it kind of had that Dungeons & Dragons feel where the characters would evolve over time. Use Excel, so this is my design lesson on this one, because it had so many cards. It had 300, maybe 400 different unique items and monsters and things in it that I had to make a spreadsheet. And this really taught me the value of using spreadsheets to track everything. Because up until that point, I was just, if I needed to know something, I would try to find the card and look at it and then reprint that one card. And once I got it into Excel, I could really manage the stats much easier. The other thing I get asked a lot from people is how did you get your job in the video game industry? I would like to work in the video game industry too. What can I do? And I got started because of this game. So I took it to Blizzard and said, hey, I made this game about Diablo. You guys want to play it? And they kind of sat down and started playing it. And it turned out the president of the Blizzard North happened to be there playing it. I didn't know it at the time. And afterwards, I said, maybe you guys can help me. I want to try to publish this. Could you guys help me publish it? And they're like, well, why don't you just work on Diablo with us instead? And a lot of it had to do more, it had to do a little, well, three things, I think. One was that, you know, it's a game based on Diablo. The other thing was I showed them that spreadsheet, and they were like, wow, this is exactly what we have to do in the video game. You're clearly, you know, you have the skills to be able to, you know, be proficient to do this. The other thing, there's only one copy of this in the world, and so I think really if they just wanted to play it again, they would have had to hire me. So another advantage to only having one copy of your game. Hyperline, so this year, so now I'm working at Blizzard, and now I'm surrounded by game designers, and they started playing some of these games like Maze and Monster Hunter and Junkyard Bots and things with me at lunch. I'd bring them in, and they were like, around September, they'd be like, what's your game going to be for Christmas? What's that going to be? Because it's got to be better than even those other ones, and they would help me. And so now I'm like surrounded by like all these game designers critiquing stuff that I'm just going to make for my kids. And Masters of Orion, actually, who's played or knows Masters of Orion? Okay, so some of you do. So it's you know, it's this game you're taking over the galaxy, and you're having a good time. Except if you play that game, the critique of that game usually is it feels like you're not flying around the galaxy. It feels like you're an accountant because you have these giant spreadsheets up, trying to keep track of all this data all the time. So I'm like, can I make Masters of Orion with no numbers? And the other thing was the pieces had to fit in a small box. This was a challenge that somebody at work gave me. They gave me this little pencil box, and they said, here, this is for your next game. And at the time, I was trying to like constrain my designs, and I'm like, whatever I make has to fit in this box. That's just going to be a design constraint I put on myself so that it doesn't sprawl. And I cheated because here's the board, which obviously doesn't fit in the box. But everything else, when you open up the box, just comes spilling out, and you get all these spaceships and counters and things like that. So it starts out pretty simple. Everybody's in the corner. You kind of flip over these tiles, and it's a little bit like Carcassonne. In fact, the tiles are just Carcassonne tiles that I put stickers over top of. And it was originally called Starcassonne. But we kind of switched around after a while. But you go down these like hyper lines, and you start to find planets. And I'll just kind of quickly flip through this as the board starts to develop up. You find different asteroids and technologies and stuff. And while you're doing that, you're picking up pieces and adding them onto your ship. So again, there's no numbers, there's nothing to really keep track of other than how big your ship is and what pieces you have. And then to keep track of damage, you just flip a piece over. So when something gets damaged, you just flip it to the other side, and now it's a damaged state, and then when you fix it, you just flip it back over again. So there's no need to keep, like, you have 7 damage points or whatever. It doesn't have any of that. So I mentioned before, cannibalize other toys. At this point, cannibalize other games, you know, like Carcassonne. These pieces are from another game. Just started like taking things that I could find. Like I did not want to try to cut these perfect squares out on my own. Actually, I tried and gave up really quick. And I'm like, somebody else already has done this for me. So for $20, I can take all of their effort. Then the other thing that was really important was this thing that I very strongly believe is that you reward your players and you never punish them. And it's really easy for game designers to punish their players. In fact, I think a lot of game designers I know would love to punish their players. They get a sick kind of little thrill out of that. It's like, oh, you did something? I'm going to punish you. You shouldn't do that. I'm going to show you. But instead, it was just the opposite. When I started playing with some of my friends, and every time something bad happened, it'd be like, oh, I don't like this game. It's not very fun. I'm getting, like, I crashed into asteroids. It's like, all right, I'll make some asteroid shields. I'll like try to like lower the damage that they do. And we just kept, everything became much more about every decision you make should make you feel better. There should be no decision that you make that you feel worse. And it's a very hard thing to do, but I try to do that in all my games from this point on. This one here, this is one of the few games actually that I brought with me, the only game I brought with me because I can travel with it. But if you have kids or you were a kid, you know what it's like to travel with your brother or sister in a car. You will hit them and fight with them most of the time on the way there. And that's what my kids were doing every day on the way to school. So 12 and 9 years old. And they're fighting all the time. The trip was only like 15 minutes or 10 minutes even, but they still managed to fight about something. So like, I'm going to make them a little game that they can play quickly in the car. And it's got to be car friendly, meaning it can't have pieces, it can't fall apart, it has to save its state so that when you stop and drop them off, you don't want them to say, we can't stop playing our game now, we can't get out of the car. So you need to make sure that it can save state so when they get back in the car, it's ready to go. And do you have these here? Have you played games like this before? So in the States, these are like kind of popular when I was a kid, but it's a bingo type game. And you just slide these little sliders when you see the thing as you're driving. And it's to keep kids happy in the cars. They try to make bingo out of that. So these were the final ones. And actually after the talk, if you want to look at these, I brought them with me. So there are these 2 little cards. Each player is one of the cards. And you can keep track of your life. and your power that you have, and little monsters pop up out of it, and you pick your spells and things like that. So the entire rules are contained on the back, so it's a very simple game. But the idea is everything just works, and then when you mess with people's spells, you can slide the little bingo slider up and cover them up. I actually destroyed one of those bingo cards to make these games. It gave its life for this game. Oh, and there's the monsters popping up. So this kind of started out as a simple rock, paper, scissors. And again, game designers, you all know rock, paper, scissors. I recommend not using rock, paper, scissors, even though it's a wonderfully great way of making games balanced quickly. It's got the drawback of getting boring really quickly. And it feels very random after a while. That why am I even deciding? It's just, I might as well flip a coin. And so I started out with the rock, paper, scissors, and I don't have time to get into it, but eventually there's a lot more options, and there's trails of like, you can only do certain options if other options have been used in the past. And the last part was breaking the symmetry. So sadly, you know, like when you think of the paper engineering about this, which I don't even remember how to build these anymore because I sealed it in glue inside of this. So it took me a long time of just like reading books about paper engineering and trying to get these little axles and things to work correctly. And I spent more time working on the game than the kids ended up playing with these cards. And the reason why is they memorized the cards really quickly and they didn't need them anymore. So they would just sit in the car and they would just like hold up their fingers for their life and their power. And they would just say 1, 2, 3, blast, 1, 2, 3, summon. And they would just like set it and it's like, wait, you guys just invalidated all of that work if I knew you could have just done it in your head. So we added a little like symmetry power. I had to try to get them back to the cards as much as I could with some very simple rules about this guy's like might be a specialist in monsters summoning and this guy might be a specialist in freezing the other guy. And just by adding that little twist to the game gives you a lot more combinations than just the straight up kind of A versus B and they're both equal. All right, 13 and 10. So this was around 13 years old. Then my older son's starting to get a lot of other activities. My younger son's playing sports. My older son's in karate. They're not there a lot. They're doing these extracurricular things. They have a lot of friends. They have a lot of other things they'd rather be doing than hanging out with their dad playing games. And I'm like, this is kind of a problem. We're setting up these Monster Hunter games and we're never playing them. Like we'll play an hour and then they just sit there for days and days before we can get back to them again. So could I make a game that could be played whenever? Like it's just always there. Whenever you want to play it, it's ready to go, but it's not taking up your dining room table. So I decided, let's use the refrigerator. What a great game surface. It doesn't get in anybody's way. At the time, it probably had pizza coupons and old drawings from kindergarten up on it still. So I cleaned everything off of it and just like, this will become the new game board. And make it more, in this case, abstract, because I'd made a lot of these like spaceship and robots and monsters type game that were all had this very strong theme. And this one I just want to be more abstract. So really quickly, you start out, each person's a color. You're trying to touch the color of dot here. So green is trying to touch green dots, and blue is trying to touch blue dots, red's trying to touch the red dots, etc. And these are a limited resource that you have, which lets you take your popsicle stick and raise it over top of other ones. But when you run out, you can't go over anymore, and you start to get trapped. So you can see it starts out very simple, but over the course of what was originally meant to be 1 week, but eventually became several years, I shall talk about in a moment, the game starts to get this interesting abstract art, kind of spaghetti quality to it, where you look at it and you're like, what is that? I don't understand. But if you had played it all the way from the beginning, it actually made sense. But just walking in, a guest would come to our house and look at that, and it's like you can't decipher what's going on, which I thought was actually a bonus. So the design lesson, long terms are fine. I talked before about you got to make your turn short, you got to keep people engaged all the time, and kind of flipping that over on its head and saying, well, what's the game with like you don't care, like it'd be really long. I love this game a lot, and one of the reasons why is because you can take forever to make your turn. You can really strategize, you can plan it out, and you always do it when no one's watching, which is the other interesting thing. Because you don't want people to see you're strategizing. You don't want people to see what you're thinking, what you're up to, and you might put 7 or 8 moves up on the refrigerator and then like, that's going to be perfect, and then take them all down again. So that's great. As long as people aren't bored, because nobody's going to be bored if you're in the room all alone, then take all the time you want. Actually makes the games really deep in some interesting ways. The other thing is just challenge conventional design wisdom. There's a lot of rules, and at this point in my design career, I'm kind of like, what are the rules? What are the things they always tell you to do as a game designer? And then just try to break them, just to see what will happen. And maybe it's a broken game, but I think it's a good design challenge anyway to try to do that, just to keep pushing yourself as a designer. All right, nanobots. At this point, I was working on Spore. You might know the game Spore at Maxis, so I wasn't working at Blizzard anymore. I'd moved over to work on Spore. I was the lead designer of the Cell game, which is the first game where these little creatures are kind of moving around through this tide pool and growing and evolving. And I wanted to make that into a board game. I want to make a 3-player game, again, only because 3-player games are traditionally hard to make for a designer. There's something about the balance and the kingmaker problems and things that occur with those. So I just wanted to experiment with that. Really fast combat. This is going to be a game about just like getting in there, again, punching people really quickly. And no randomness, because it's easy, I think, it's easy to make a fast-paced game with randomness. It gets very hard to make a fast-paced game that you can see all the turns and all the moves, because you get this analysis paralysis happening. So this was kind of a view of the game here. You had these little things, you tile them together. And so I milled these out of metal and cut these all out. A friend had a mill in his garage, and so we like worked out all these pieces and clips and everything that you could pin these all together and make your crazy cell type creatures. It was set more in the future because I really wanted, when I worked on Spore, to have lasers on the cells, and Will Wright was like, you can't put lasers on cells. I'm like, but it would be so cool. But yeah, so anyway, I could do it in my own board game. So, you know, no randomness equals slow game, and I just couldn't get around it. No matter what I tried to speed that game up, if it had no randomness, it was slow. People thought too much. And it just, I kept hitting my head against it and finally just gave up, and it's like, this game's going to be slow. I've lost on that one. Then, you know, use your board game as a pitch for a video game. So what happened was, a couple years after we had released Spore, the Maxis studio is part of EA, and I don't know how these big corporations work, but one day our general manager came in and said, we have $1 million. If we don't spend it in 6 months, we lose it. Does anybody have an idea for how to spend $1 million in 6 months? And I was like, I have this board game here. Can we make it into a video game? And looks good, you know. So that was kind of my pitch, was to bring in the board game and turn it into a video game, which became Microbot, which actually you can still get on Xbox or PlayStation Network. But you can kind of see you're basically building up these robots that shoot lasers, and multiplayer game, and that did have all the fast action that I was actually craving, so maybe I should have made a video game to begin with. All right, Weapons of Zombie Destruction, one of my personal favorites of all the games. So this one actually started because of that name. I'm like, Weapons of Zombie Destruction, that's an awesome name. There has to be a game that is worthy of that name. And at the time, like, how do I compete with video games? Now, my kids, what, 15 and 12 at this time, they're always playing video games, all the time. And to try to get them to play a board game or a card game was very difficult. It's like, they'd much rather play Tony Hawk or whatever game was the current game than they would getting out of a board game. So this was my design goal. It's like, on Christmas, when they open up this game, I'm also going to give them, I think it actually was Tony Hawk that year, I'm going to give them Tony Hawk, and I'm going to give them WZD. And I'm going to open both up, and I'm going to watch which one they play first. And if they run to the Xbox and they put in Tony Hawk, I lose. But if they want to play this game, then I win. So here's how I did it. I cheated a lot. First of all, I took 100 zombies from this game called HeroScape. You might be familiar with it. I ordered 100 of these zombies, which are like about that big and all hand-painted, and they're really beautiful as zombies go. And then it's like, and they need to be killed by robots. And when they open this box, it's going to be just filled with zombies and robots. And how could you not want to play that game? You guys all want to play that game right now, I can tell just by looking at it. And it had to play fast. This is my thing now. It's like, everything's got to be fast. It's got to like compete with video games. It's got to just have energy all the time. So here was kind of an earlier version of the game. The kids were playing a lot of Portal at the time, and so these are all like the companion cubes, and it was meant to be based in Aperture Labs, which is where that game takes place. And so you're all robots, and then the zombies kind of stream in. It's like a little bit like a tower defense kind of game. So here's some action poses of zombies fighting robots. There's just 100 zombies just swarming over these 4 lone robots. It's really spectacular. Here's the final version once I got started like doing some laser etching and things like that on the final board, and this came out really good. Had kind of a programming component to it too. You'd be programming your robot, so I kind of told myself as a good father, I'm teaching my kids to program by killing zombies with robots. So these were some of the cards that you could put down. One of the ways that I reduced downtime in this game was everybody goes at the same time. So you all plan, you all think, and then you all put down your card, and when everybody's card's down, then the turn starts. And then since it's a program, nobody has to think during the actual execution phase. It just happens. And so that's good. It's like, so as long as everybody's thinking at the same time, there's no problem because there's no downtime. It's when one person finishes first and they're bored waiting for the other ones that you get the problem. And then this other thing, this very subtle thing came up is like, who are you in this game? And originally you were the robot. So you'd play the game and you'd be the robot and you'd feel bad. You'd start playing the game and you'd crash into walls and you would like shoot the wrong direction. You'd miss the zombies and you would think to yourself, it's like, I don't like I don't like who I am in this game. I would never crash into a wall. And so with a very simple fix, which had nothing to do with any rules at all, at the beginning of the game I just said, you are a scientist programming a robot. And that one little change switches it all around, because now when your robot crashes into a wall, you're not the robot, you're actually the making the mistake, you're a bad programmer. And that actually fixed everything in a really subtle way that I, to this day, I'm always thinking about who is the player. What is their role? Who should they be? Why are they even there? Why are they in this world right now? And getting that sorted out and making sure that it's a strong connection between who they want to be and what they see through all the pieces is very important. Soccer bots this year, so 2008, they're 16 and 13. My younger son is playing soccer. Toby was coaching soccer, so I'm like, a game about soccer will be great. I'm gonna fix nanobot speed problems once and for all. This is a challenge. I'm going to make a game with no randomness that is fast. I'm gonna do it this time no matter what. I had access to a laser cutter now, so I'm starting to make my own custom pieces, which is kind of fun. And then, like I mentioned, a sports game. So it wasn't about like killing robots. It was about like they're just playing soccer on this field. This is just some of the templates that I used to cut out all the pieces. And then this is the final board here, where you would assemble different turrets and movement pieces and things like that. And then there was a ball that you would try to like shoot into the goal. And eventually, unfortunately, I had to add a timer into it, which I didn't want to do, but that was my total cheat. It's like, you know what, I don't know how to make this game fast. I'm just going to put a timer on it. And I felt really, really guilty, because it's like solving this complex problem with just this big hammer. And just like, I'm just going to like, whatever. But it actually worked for a sports game, because we're used to sports games having timers on them, real world sports games. So it actually helps that illusion that you have a certain amount of time. So it's just a chess clock, and you only have a little bit of time to make your move or you fail. So now up this point, so 2008, I'm starting to switch over this idea of like, instead of cannibalizing pieces, I can now like make my own pieces that are perfect for just what I need. It's getting easier and easier all the time to just go out and laser cut stuff and have special wood cut, things like that. Then the other thing I mentioned, if you want to control the length of a turn, just use a timer. That's my design lesson now, and I've stopped on that problem. It's like games with no randomness are going to be long. I know, I'm happy to have discussions about that afterwards if anybody wants to, because I'm still like, I just gave up on the problem. All right, swords. So this game here, 2009, Monster Hunter, as I mentioned, it's this epic game. It takes over the table for a long amount of time. So I was like, can I make a faster version of that now? And you start to see this trend in my design. It's like everything just it's got to be like a video game now. I'm trying to make board games like video games with that energy. It's very difficult to do. Ben Boos was an artist on Diablo, and if you play Diablo, and you might recognize this intricate kind of stuff that Ben does all by hand. There's no like Photoshop. He just like hand paints all this stuff, just beautiful stuff. So he had just came out with this book called Swords, and I was talking to him about it. And he's like, "Oh, let's make a game based around this book." So I kind of laser cut out a bunch of different swords from the book. And it's very similar to Monster Hunter, the game I showed earlier, but you have these army. Instead of one hero, you're this army. And the kind of gimmick of the game is that these guys are just peasants until you give them a sword. And as soon as you give them a sword, they get superpowers. And if they die, that's okay, because there's always more peasants, but don't lose this sword, whatever you do. That sword is really worth a lot. And so there's a lot of mechanics in the game about protecting your weapons at the expense of these hapless peasants that they just will never end. You have an infinite supply of peasants. So look outside your game's domain is one of the design lessons I learned, because when I started this, it was all about what, Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing and things like that, and it just didn't have the energy that I was looking for. So I started looking at other games. It's like, what games have a lot of energy that you just see people so engaged in? And one of them is craps. So you go to Vegas or any gambling place, and you watch people play craps. And they're standing around a table for sometimes hours just cheering and excited and energized. It's like, that's the game basically that I pulled in, so that instead of rolling dice though, in this game you roll the peasants. And it's like if they land on their heads, they die. And if they land on their feet, they do like super damage. Then dynamic in-game balancing. This was set up, this was kind of a counter to the Monster Hunter spreadsheet, where with Monster Hunter I spent so much time tuning those charts and tables. And with this one, I'm just going to let the players balance it. And actually from Puerto Rico, the idea was taken from that. If you played Puerto Rico, it's like monsters that hang out on the board just get worth more and more points. And so the players self-balance all the values of these. And so instead of me having to figure out in advance what each monster should be worth, the players will just do it for you. And that was great, because then I could just make any monster I wanted that just sounded cool and just throw it into the game and not really even have to think too much. It's like, let the players do the thinking on that. All right, 1001 Words. This is a more recent game that I did. The design goal is to make a party game, and now, so the kids are 18, 15. My older son is actually going off to college at this time, and I'm like, it's going to be very hard to get the family together and play some games anymore. And so I asked Toby, I said, like, what kind of game should I make? I'm kind of stumped. I don't know what to do. I definitely don't want to do anything with robots and monsters and spaceships anymore. It's kind of like getting tired of that. And she's like, well, why don't you make a party game? And I'm like, well, I don't make party games. I'm not that kind of designer. And of course, well, if you were a good designer, you can make a party game. So I made a party game. And she really likes word games, so this game was mostly for her. We were, well, so no magic weapons or robots, I just mentioned. At the time, if you remember this game, Words with Friends, some of you may be still playing Words with Friends, but I don't know here, but in the States it kind of took off. Everybody was playing Words with Friends for a long time. And Toby was playing it all the time too, and so I'm like, could I make a game that would get her not to play Words with Friends? But you still play Words with Friends, right? Okay, but she still plays this game too, so that's good. All right, so this one was kind of backwards. It's called 1001 Words. Again, this was the title. I had the title first before I had any idea what to do. So I went to the laser cutter. I had a friend who had access to a laser cutter, so I went to her and I'm like, can you help me cut out 1001 word tiles? And I had no idea what I was going to do with them. And I just cut them all out. I had this huge bag, like 1001 tiles turned out to be like, it's a pretty big bag of words. And I looked at it, it's like, if I can't make a game, if any of you in the room can't make a game out of 1001 word tiles, then you should just quit being a game designer, because it's just like, it just suggests so many games when you have this big bag of words. So I just started playing around with some ideas. We eventually came up with this kind of word association type game where you're trying to get people to guess the words you're thinking of by putting words out on the board. So for instance, I don't know, so like what do you think of when I say garbage monster? Anybody? In the back? Oscar the Grouch, correct, so you get a point. So you're trying to get, so you write down like what you're trying to get people to think of. And it was really great with this game. It's almost like a mind-reading game in a weird way, because you have to understand how the other person thinks. You can't do your associations, like things in your own head. If they don't get out, if they don't mean something to somebody else, they're worthless. So this was kind of a mystical game in a way that really makes you understand and learn about people. This is a final laser cut board, and all kind of put together with everything was all like laser cut and hand stained and all of that over time. So designing from a title I mentioned, it's kind of a fun way to design. Just think of something cool and just start making it. Let players play as themselves, and what I mean by this one is it's kind of counter to what I just said earlier, which is like, who are you in this game? You're a robot scientist. It's like, no, you just are you. And I have to know you. I have to understand you to get you to win this game with me as a team. We have to understand how we think. And like I mentioned, it's kind of fun, like you play with players that you've never even met before. You're just at a game party and some random people sit down. After a few rounds, the first few rounds are just these complete misses. And then you start to realize it's like, oh, they're really into science fiction. Now I can start making science fiction references. And then you start to learn slowly about the person you're playing with, which is very magical. And also, you should all get a friend with a laser cutter. That's the takeaway here. Crash City, I was working on Sim City this year, and I just wanted to make Sim City the board game, just because I like making board games based on video games, as you could tell. The video game, all the while we were working on the game for like 4 years, we were like, it's about the people, it's not about the buildings. That was this mantra that we just kept telling ourselves on the team. Everything about the game has to be about people, because cities are people. Buildings aren't cities. I might have said that backwards, but you get the idea. So focus on the people, not the buildings. That was kind of my goal for this game. It's kind of a version of it, an earlier version of it, where you're these little race cars and you're moving around, and everybody gets up in the morning from their house and they try to rush to work as fast as possible. And then when all the jobs are taken, the game ends. So if you're familiar with worker placement game, this is what I call worker racement game. So you're just driving around. Whoever gets the jobs wins. And so the first stage of the game, you're building up this big city, and then the second stage, you're just racing around really fast, and cutting people off. So give the players what they want. This was one, it was originally just called Race City, And my sons were like, you know what, we should crash into each other. I'm like, I don't want you guys crashing into each other. You're just trying to like get to work. You don't crash each other. And it's like, but these are race cars, Dad, and they're going really fast, and I'm trying to cut this guy off and get to work. And I kind of like rebelled against it or pushed against it, and finally I was like, you know what, this game might be better if it did have crashes in it. So we added them in, and I changed the name, and the game is much better. Follow the fun, just kind of follow it along. The original version of this game actually is very similar in mechanics, but I use meeples instead of race cars. And in that early version of the game, it was like, I get up in the morning as a meeple, as a person, and I walk to work every day, and I get money, and I go back and I shop, and then I go home. It's like, this works really good for SimCity when the computer's doing that, but it's the most, mechanically it might be very interesting, but to play it, it's very depressing. It's like, that's what I do every day in real life. Like, why do I need to play a game where I get up and get money so I can buy stuff and go back home and do it the next day? So we just kind of like changed it around over time and came up with something that really isn't SimCity anymore, but still has its own charm to it. And like, don't write down the rules. Kind of a lot of when you work on your game, it's always like, write down your rules, make sure everybody knows your rules. You have to be able to like hand this rules sheet to somebody. They need to be able to play their game without you telling them what to do. It's like, you know what, you don't need to do that unless you're trying to publish your game. As long as you're there, you can just tell people, and then you can just invent rules on the fly too, which I do all the time, which makes people really mad. Battle lines, so this is about a year ago, so I'm almost done here. I'm rushing through these, I know. Are we doing okay? Maybe like an hour over, I don't even know. Battle lines, this year, both of the kids are gone to college. They were like, I don't know what I'm going to do, so I'm going to like try. I was going to stop actually. I'm like, I'm done making games for Christmas. I'm not going to do this anymore. But then I started thinking about, it's like, maybe we could do a play-by-mail game. And for those of you who are older in the audience, know that there was once this thing called a play-by-mail game where you would actually like write your turn on a postcard and send it in, and before email, and you would wait a month and you get your chess move back, and you would like write your chess move down and you would send the next one back. And a lot of you are nodding your heads. That's great. That means I'm not the only oldest guy here in the room. So this play-by-mail game, and the thing that came up is like, why would anybody want to do that anymore? Like, why don't I just email the turns to them, which I'll talk about in a moment. Frictionless turns, meaning that I knew that if I sent something to my kids in college and they had to think for any amount of time longer than a minute, it would get shoved on a desk and they would forget to turn their turns back in. And so this was really the hardest part of the design of this game, was how can I make a game that when they open the envelope, they can make their turn and put it back in the mailbox without even turning around. They can do that all at their like post box at the campus. And this last part I just mentioned, that something that wouldn't work through email, what would that be? And I spent a long time having these philosophical discussions with my friends about like, why would you even do this game? Like, why shouldn't I just make a web page and they could just click on it? That would be so much easier to do. What is it about mail that would make this game better or more interesting? Very, very interesting thing to consider. So this is kind of like one of the final envelopes. I sent them this. I sent them a couple stickers. They open it up. There's a postcard inside. This is actually the front and back of the postcard. They can write a little note here, and they'll stick some stickers onto it. I get that, and then I process it, meaning I print out another card. And so I take their stickers, and then I just, in Adobe Illustrator, I just like make a new card that shows their lines. And then it's a territory control game where this globe is spinning every turn, and it's a 20-sided globe, and so every turn it just switches to the next facet. And I think we're at turn 17 right now, 2 years later. And it just, as it spins, they're adding more and more lines to it as you try to control territory. And you can just kind of see a few frames here that I put together. So design lessons, number one, never make a board game that's an icosahedron, which is a 20-sided solid. That was the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. I just got these out of order. But do concentrate on textures and touch. So this was the thing that a computer screen will never have is this sense of touch. Yeah, sure, you touch plastic, you touch glass. It's a lot different, like touching nice paper, touching cardboard, touching metal, touching these different things. And so really focusing on those textures and that heaviness is kind of the superpower of board game designers, because there's no computer that can do that even close. Here's the icosahedron. This is what the game looks like to me. So to make the game frictionless on their end, I have to have a lot of friction on my end, which means I'm unfolding these icosahedrons and then trying to do the math to figure out like how much area these shapes on this surface, and believe me, you do not want to see the Excel spreadsheet. So that's terrible, don't do that ever. And then this quote was my favorite quote, though, afterwards, because my goal was to try to make this game that couldn't be played through a web page or email. And my son was like, the game's pretty good, but sending stuff through mail is so much better. And I realized at that point they had never corresponded through mail, ever in their life. They had at times sent the thank you note back to their grandma for a present, which of course was actually Toby's doing. They just kind of wrote a little note and she did everything else. But this was the first time they actually had talked back and forth. And so this note here, they taunt each other back and forth through, they're basically trash talking each other every turn. And that's their favorite part of the game. You probably can't read it. I can't even really read it. Their handwriting's terrible, because that's another problem with kids these days, is they don't learn how to write. So then I retype it and try to get it. And that's what they look forward to when they get one of these about once a month. They open it up and they read the quote and they think of something funny and put it in there. But they also get all beaten up and they're real. They're like this thing you can hold on to. And so I'm getting this big collection of these things, which I have no idea what I'll do with when we finish, but I'll think of something. All right, the last game here, and then I'll wrap it up, is the one I've been working on from last year. The design goal really was, I got a year-long subscription to a membership to a thing called the Tech Shop, which they have in the States, which is basically you can go in and use all their laser cutters and CNC tools and everything. It's metal and everything. They got this basically tech haven there. And so that year was like, I just want to make a game that utilizes the Tech Shop. Our old refrigerator broke, and we had to get rid of it, and so I don't want to reset up the fridge game anymore because it was already just stalling forever. We could only play it basically when the kids come home for holidays, which was taking way too long. When you only make one turn every season, that's too long. And then 2 players, because there's only 2 people in the house now. So what could I do to make that a game? And originally it was called Ultimate Frisbee, if you know Ultimate Frisbee. And you're running plays. If you've played that, there's a new Star Wars miniatures game where you put down the arrows and you move around. It's kind of like that, except you're trying to just throw a Frisbee around and run plays up on the refrigerator. Eventually I switched over, actually just very recently, to use letters instead, because I wanted Toby to play it with me, and running plays on the refrigerator wasn't actually appealing as much, but making words was. So now there's these kind of bridges, and you're making these word patterns on the refrigerator, and trying to play kind of a Scrabble-like game, but it's also got this geometry aspect of going over and under and around to make your letters form. And this is still a work in progress. Don't be afraid to start over. Yeah, Ultimate Frisbee didn't work, whatever. I'll just change it into something else and make some new pieces. And you can't play test without players. This is the other thing too. I kept wanting to play that Frisbee game, but there's nobody around to play it with. And it's like, why am I making a game where there's nobody that even wants to play it? It's not going to be a very good design ever, because I'll never be able to iterate on it. So make your games for your audience. Figure out who that audience is. All right, so what next? I'm going to wrap up here. Obviously I've lost my captive audience. I'm the dad. Hey, play a game. Guess what? I'm your dad. You're going to sit down here and play this game whether you like it or not. I can't do that anymore. So they're just gone. So what am I going to do now? Just to kind of show, here's that picture in the beginning, and this is more recent. This is what happens. And any of you who are parents, you kind of, you feel this, right? You feel this transition. It happens so quick. The technology keeps advancing. In the beginning, I'm like woodworking, painting, and now it's like laser cutting, metal printing. I'm just like, whatever I can think of. I'm starting to what's the craziest thing I can possibly think of? I want to do that now. And there's this pull and push on me for video games. I get paid to make video games, so I don't feel like I need to come home and make video games. And I want to make these tangible things. I want to make these physical things. But still, the connections between the two are getting tighter and tighter and tighter, I feel. A lot more games are putting electronic pieces in them, for instance. So I'm interested to see where that goes in the future. All right, and then I'm going to conclude 19 years, which I've already summed up in an hour, into now 1 minute. So make your own personal games. I know a lot of you here make games. A lot of you here make games because you want to sell your games and make a lot of money. You don't have to, really. You could, unless, if you have another job, then you don't really need to. You can just make games because they're fun to play. It's a kind of an odd concept, but it can be done. So think small. Don't go out really big. Just what's a small thing that I can do? Just, instead of thinking of how am I going to sell 1 million units, think how am I going to entertain these 2 people? It's a completely different way of thinking about the process. And you know how many compromises you have to make when you're trying to make 1 million people happy. If you're really making 3 people happy, That's like, it's very personal, it's very focused. You can really get a lot of stuff done, interesting things. Think long term. Again, I mentioned this a couple times during the talk. If you don't have a deadline, then you don't need a deadline. Deadlines will force you to compromise. Deadlines will force you to make decisions and things that you wish you didn't have to make. And the real world is filled with deadlines. Anybody who has a job understands this. So in the non-real world, which oddly enough is your life, think long term. You don't think about, what am I going to do next week? What can I do in 19 years? And challenge yourself constantly. Don't just do the thing that someone else does. Like say, like, what shouldn't I do? I'm going to do that just to see what's going on. All right, so I'll end it with that. And the website, stonetronics.com, if you're interested, there's a bunch of design lectures and other things that I have up there as well. All right, so thank you very much.